right, y'all. Welcome back. Today, Wednesday, we've got our final. Actually, this should say final, but the last talk on the priesthood before our test tomorrow. I'll have put a study guide on Canvas. It'll be in the lecture notes for today, and it'll be also in the module section, so you can get it from both places. But again, this will be the last test before our final take-home test the next week. And today, what I really want to talk about is what about the call to the priesthood? Um, I think it's another one of those things that gets overlooked, like we said yesterday, about how commonplace things can be, especially if you've grown up in New Orleans in the Catholic school environment where you routinely hear. I mean, I remember, I think I mentioned this one other time, but when I was in St. Catherine's, they would split up the girls and the boys like in seventh grade, and all the boys, we went to this conference room where they wheeled in a TV with a VHS player underneath it. They popped in this VHS, and it was like this really old priest who was looking at his books, and he turns around and says, "Oh, didn't see you there," and he asked like, "Have you ever thought about becoming a priest?" And then they would bring in one of the parish priests, and he talked to us about being a priest. And so by the time you reach senior year of high school, you are so sick of little gimmicks like that, of there being some kind of vocations day, hearing pray for vocations for men and women to be in the religious life, or specifically for men to be priests, that we just tune it out, right? And we think that anyone that kind of entertains that call is just, they're the odd man out, right? Like they're the kind of the weirdo. The reason I've got a picture of Toby here, you might not know about this in the lore of The Office, but Toby at one point had entered the seminary, but then he leaves the seminary because he's like, I really wanted to, I really like this girl Kathy, so he left the seminary, right? And him and God's relationship never quite really pan out there. But a lot of the answers that I get for why have I not thought about the priesthood, or if you ask someone, have you thought about the priesthood, is the most common is this: I already know it's not for me. I've thought about it, and Mr. Ford's like, I know it's not for me. I'm not called to be a priest. I asked this question on a survey at the beginning of the year. Almost everyone responded that they already know they're not called to be a priest. It's probably too early for you to say whether or not you're called to be a priest. Maybe, maybe not. But my guess is that the main reason people have decided they don't want to be a priest, or that clearly the priesthood is not for them, is the lack of romantic life, right? Of not being able to have a family, have a wife, things like that. And I hope, well, maybe not so much a hope, but the point of calling this Fatherhood Part 2 is to understand sometimes that feeling of wanting to have a family doesn't always mean being called to, say, biological fatherhood, but perhaps it could be a call to spiritual fatherhood. And my other favorite one is like, well, I'm already in a relationship right now. Let me tell you something. High school relationships almost never pan out. Most of you will break up with your girlfriend by sometime in the middle of summer before you go off to college. Or if you do stay together, you'll break up midway through first semester. And if you don't, maybe you've got a shot. But that's also a terrible excuse. Also, for the other reason, the fact that so many of the priests that I know, and I'm talking about the good priests that I know, had girlfriends, relationships, well into college, and up until the point they joined the seminary, they were in a relationship. That is a good thing for a priest to have been in relationships, like have girlfriends and things like that. I'm not knocking priests that never did. I'm just saying that you being in a relationship, especially in high school, has no bearing upon whether or not God is calling you to the priesthood. That's just one of those common misconceptions that gets put out there. And again, we already talked about these two things. And this is just a picture of Grand Coteau. That's the seminary that you would go to, the novitiate, if you entered the Jesuits. Okay. So here's a picture of Ignatius at Manresa. Again, this idea of discernment, asking God what it is that he wants for you. But the two questions that I have on here, they actually, I didn't come up with these. I mean, I could come up with them, but this was given in a talk by Reed Merrick, who was a senior, I guess, 2 or 3 years ago. And Reed joined the Army right after high school. He went straight into boot camp. He was a very good cross country runner, but I'd say much more on the effort side than the talent side. This guy was successful, one of the best runners in the state his senior year because of the effort that he put into it. But But he had this way of thinking where he said, how often we think, what do I want to do with my life? Or how often you're asked by your parents, your aunts and uncles, your college counselor, what do you want to do with your life? And how very little we ever ask ourselves the question, or anybody asks us the question, but what does God want you to do with your life? And this can apply to whether or not you have a vocation to the priesthood or married life. But asking this question, God, what do you want me to do with my life? That's going to give you the best answer. And when you ask that question, you don't want to game the system and just say, God, what do you want me to do with my life? And I also already know that it's not the priesthood. And I think as long as you ask this question honestly and let it take you where it's going to take you, you'll be fine. You will find out, in fact, if you're called to the priesthood or not. Um, but if you always game the system where you've eliminated a possibility before you even ask the question, well, then no true discernment can really take place, right? You're kind of you're rigging the system so that you get the answer that you always wanted. Not that this is not a bad question to ask, but it's certainly not the best question or the only question to ask. And so Ignatius would have you do is imagine yourself being a priest. What does it feel like? Write that down in a journal. Does it bring you joy? Does it bring you peace? Imagine yourself being married. Imagine yourself having a family. What is it like? In my own life, I asked Father Fitzgerald this question when I was in high school, and I was in a high school relationship with my now wife. But I asked Father Fitzgerald, how do I choose between these two things? And this was his advice, which is what Ignatius would have you do, is to imagine yourself in these positions and what brings you the most joy and peace. And what I found in my life, which was maybe really revealing to me and really did help, was that where I found the most joy and the most peace was in the idea of being a father, right? Of doing fatherly kind of things. But the scary part of that discernment was the fact that that could apply to both, right? It could apply to married life or it could apply to being a priest. But when I looked at some of the other reasons I felt drawn to being a priest, it was giving a good homily, like thinking of how bored I am at Mass sometimes. And man, if I could give the homily, I'd be better. Thinking about how cool it would be to wear like the all black stuff of the Jesuits and things like that. Well, those aren't really life-giving reasons. Those aren't going to sustain you. In the same way, like that, if you think about with married life, that the only reason you're really called to the married life is that you want to have that romantic life, or that you want to have that kind of status symbol of either I'm married or I've checked that off the list. Well, those aren't life-giving reasons either, right? But when you find that true joy and peace in that discernment process, you want to then evaluate that, bring that back into prayer, ask God again, okay, God, I find peace in this. Is this what you're calling me to? And that rhythm of that imagination, reflection, and prayer to God, do that over the course of a couple months, a couple years. You're going to find your vocation, right? You're not going to find your vocation. So that's kind of a good and encouraging point to think about, that you don't have to go in, especially at 18 years old, knowing whether or not you're called to married life or to be a priest, whether you're called to be an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor or what have you. You just need to ask God the question over and over and over again. And if you ask that question honestly, you will get the answer. Maybe not in the timeline that you wanted, maybe not in the way you wanted, and it might not be what you wanted to hear, but you will get an answer. And so with that, just one last kind of thing here, I'd say also man up. And I know that this can be a politically charged comment these days, but being a priest, like we said yesterday, takes a lot of courage to be a priest in the modern world. And so you shouldn't be afraid to kind of man up and have that courageous mindset of saying, look, I know this is kind of weird according to society. I know that people in society right now, especially with the sex abuse stuff, don't like priests. Father Halloran, who I told you about before, O'Halloran, he was talking about the fact that like when he wears his clerics, right, his black and white priest uniform, in the New York subway system, he gets spit upon. Like people would just spit at him, curse at him, flick him off, call him all kind of names, all because of the sex abuse scandal. Now he didn't do any of that stuff, right? He's a good priest. But people have a disdain for priests, and so you got to be willing to take on that sacrifice as well. Being a priest is not for guys that don't have courage in their heart. So it takes a lot of courage just to man up and follow Christ. And so you see that, right? The kind of the cheesier saying that you may have heard, but it comes from God: "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." But if you feel a call to the priesthood, you should talk to some good priests. Like talk to Father Dyer, talk to Father Brown. I know in my own home parish, talking to Father Tim or Father Andrew. If you live on the North Shore, one of my classmates from Jesuit, Father Jared Rodrigue, so he's my age, right? Like he's a priest on the North Shore. I've got a couple friends that that were from Jesuit that were my age that are becoming priests. But my favorite story is from my college roommate, who I may have mentioned before. He had, I think it's 7 or 8 different majors in college, like where he kept switching his major because he didn't know what he wanted to do. He did chemistry, he did biology, he did environmental science, he did accounting. He was in every single college and declared all kind of different majors because he's a guy that a lot of things interest him. He's also a kleptomaniac. He likes to steal things. There was a waffle iron at Notre Dame that you put the waffle mix in, you clamp it down, and the waffle comes out with the Fighting Irish logo on one side and the big ND on the other side. And they don't sell these; they are they're rentals. But if you buy them without the logo, they run about like $3,000. And he really wanted it, so he walked into the cafeteria with bolt cutters, cut the bolts that chained it to the wall, and then sprinted out. And he gave it to his parents for Christmas one year, and it was a couple years later that they figured out that he stole it. But his parents loved Notre Dame, and so they didn't give it back, but they did make him make a donation to Notre Dame. So as far as I know, they still have it. I mean, he'd also, when we were roommates pretty much our entire time at Notre Dame. He'd come back with a whiteboard from a chemistry lab, and I would ask him where he got it, and he said, "I don't know, I just took it from the classroom." He came back with a computer one time. I made him return the computer. He'd walk into the grocery store on campus and just take Red Bulls. Um, so kind of a crazy guy. Uh, what ends up happening though, as a joke, so at this point in my life, I was already engaged, but there was this online survey for, do you have a vocation to the priesthood? And the questions were terrible. I mean, this is as bad as it gets, right? The questions were, your ideal Saturday night, you would, and one was like go out partying, or the other stay inside and pray. So I gamed the system by answering every single question, blatantly clear that I was religious minded, right? But I signed it not with my name, but with his name and his email address and his phone number and his physical address. And he ends up getting 23 different orders and dioceses contacting him saying, "We think you have a call to the priesthood." One of those people that contacted him was the Congregation for the Holy Cross, the very order that runs the University of Notre Dame, whose vocations director, Father Jim Gallagher, lived in our dorm. So every dorm has a priest in it. And Father Jim, who's known us forever, who has seen my roommate do all of these crazy things, knocks on his door and says, like, "Do we need to talk?" And he's like, "About what?" Right? Because again, I signed him up for this, right? So they end up talking though, and turns out for the last year he had been thinking about being a priest, but had not really done anything about it. Now I'm not saying that the joke that I was trying to play on him is what made him into a priest, but he started talking to people, and there's this great priest at Notre Dame, Father Pete McCormick. You can go look him up. He's the basketball chaplain. If you ever watch Notre Dame basketball, Elijah will know him. Father Pete McCormick is always on the bench. He's a great basketball player himself. And Father Pete's just a normal, down-to-earth guy. And so my roommate started talking to him, and eventually he decides to apply to the seminary. This weekend, I was supposed to be up at Notre Dame for his ordination. So he's going to be ordained a priest. He's a deacon right now. And it got canceled because of the coronavirus. But my wife and I, were going to go up and see him. And so all of us that were best friends with him in college, we did a Zoom thing over this weekend just to catch up. And we were laughing, right? Like one of my friends from college is running for state senator in Indiana. One of them is an advertising like idea guy for this agency. His biggest client is Discover, so he does the ad campaigns for Discover. Another one of my friends from college is a doctor in Orange County. Another one is an IT specialist in Chicago. Like we're joking. My wife is a lawyer. Another one of our friends is also a lawyer. But then, I'm a Catholic high school teacher. But my roommate and my best man in my wedding is a deacon. He's being ordained a priest, and it's supposed to be this weekend. And it was not a thought that he had had for very long at the time, but he responded to it. He didn't close the door on it, and now he'll be ordained a priest. And I'm not saying that I'm not condoning thievery and theft, but if you're gonna want to go to a priest maybe to confession, it's not bad to have a guy that has lived out some of these things. I'm not saying that you should go live them out, but he's a normal guy, and I guess if I could leave you with one piece of advice, is that if you feel any kind of call to the priesthood, anything at all, it doesn't mean that you have to be a priest. It doesn't mean that you're going to be a priest. But don't close the door on that call, because it may be through discerning a vocation of the priesthood that you meet your wife. You realize like you're not called to be a priest, and you realize you have a different calling. Or it may be the fact that God really is calling you to be a priest. And when you see these good priests like Father Shaughnessy, Father Brown, Father Dyer, Father Andrew, again, if you haven't met him at St. Catherine's, really great, dynamic young priest. Uh, when you see these guys on fire for the faith because they've said yes to the call that they were given, um, you realize there's a deeper joy there, a deeper peace that can't be bought, right? And so when you ask God, what is it that you want me to do with your life? You're gonna get an answer. And if that answer is the priesthood, don't be afraid and man up, have the courage to go pursue it, because you might be surprised about how awesome it really is. Okay, so that's it for today. Don't forget, test tomorrow on everything we've done since our last test. Study guide is in the lecture notes. And then I will see you on Friday for our wrap up on the test and then the priesthood. All right, guys, take it easy and good luck on the test.